There are thousands of federal firearms laws on the books today. So I'm not going to share all of them, but here are 5 critical firearms laws that every law-abiding gun owner should understand. First is the National Firearms Act, which was passed in 1934. Would you believe that in the 1920s, you could purchase a Tommy gun for $11 and have it delivered right to your front door? What a wonderful country we live in. In 1929, 7 members and associates of Chicago's North Side Gang were murdered on Valentine's Day. The man believed to be responsible was the legendary Al Capone, and the weapon used was a Tommy gun. Now, this act of extreme violence came to be known as the St. Valentine's Day Massacre. Now, shortly after this, the National Firearms Act was introduced as a way to restrict transactions in NFA firearms and to reduce the ability for these types of firearms to be used in crimes. The NFA Act was initially enacted in 1934 and was later amended as Title II of the Gun Control Act in 1968. Currently, it places a tax on the manufacturer, transfer, and special occupational tax to businesses importing, manufacturing, and dealing in NFA firearms. The goal of the tax was to make the purchase of these types of firearms so expensive that many people simply couldn't afford to own them. In 1934, the tax rate was set at $200. Now, thankfully, this tax did not increase with inflation, because if it did, a $200 tax in 1934 would cost over $3,800 in 2020. As of now, the following types of firearms fall under the category of a National Firearms Act firearm: short barrel rifles, short barrel shotguns, machine guns, silencers, and destructive devices. Federal gun law number 2 is the Gun Control Act. In 1968, the Gun Control Act was passed to impose stricter licensing and regulation on the firearms industry, establish new categories of firearms offenses, and prohibit the sale of firearms and ammunition to felons and certain other prohibited persons. Primary goal of the Gun Control Act was to regulate the interstate transfer of firearms except among licensed dealers. Federal gun law number 3. The Firearm Owners Protection Act. In 1986, the Firearm Owners Protection Act, also known as FOIPA, was passed to amend the Gun Control Act. FOIPA allowed the interstate sale of long guns on a limited basis. It legalized ammunition shipments through USPS, removed the requirement for record keeping on the sale of non-armor-piercing ammo, and created the safe passage provision. Now, the most painful thing that FOIPA did was ban the manufacturer of new machine guns for civilian sales. I was only 3 years old, and it was the worst day of my life. The safe passage provision creates a standardized process for law-abiding gun owners to transport a firearm through a state with highly restrictive gun laws. Now, I'll put a link here to a video where you can learn more about how to transport a firearm through a highly restricted state like the state of New York while following FOIPA. The 4th federal gun law is the Brady Handgun Violence Protection Act, also known as the Brady Law, which was passed in 1993. This law was passed to reduce gun violence in the wake of the failed assassination attempt of President Ronald Reagan. Now, the purpose of the Brady Law was very clear: create mandatory background checks on firearm purchases throughout the United States, impose a 5-day waiting period on the purchase of a handgun, amend the Gun Control Act, and create the National Instant Criminal Background Check System, commonly referred to as NICS. Now, in 1998, when the NICS system was completed, the mandatory 5-day waiting period on purchasing a handgun was lifted. Now, you're probably wondering if the Brady Act had any effect on reducing violent crimes with firearms. According to a study published in the Journal of the American Medical Association in the year of 2000, the Brady Handgun Violence Protection Act had 0 impact on reducing homicide rates. I find it extremely fascinating that even though the data shows us that these types of laws do not stop evil people from committing acts of extreme violence, the gun control community still wants to pass more gun control laws. The fifth federal gun law every gun owner needs to know is the federal assault weapons ban. Now, the official title was the Public Safety and Recreational Firearms Use Protection Act. You gotta love how these politicians use very friendly titles. You can tell they've tested this. They use friendly titles to disguise a gun grab. Now, the federal assault weapons ban prohibited the manufacture of certain semi-automatic firearms defined as assault weapons, including certain magazines defined as high capacity, even though these magazines are the standard size created for the firearm by the manufacturer. Now, this bill only applied to firearms or magazines manufactured after the date the bill was signed into law. This law had one goal in mind: to reduce firearm homicides, gun crimes, and mass shootings. Now, studies show that the federal assault weapons ban had little impact on lowering firearm homicides and little to no effect on reducing gun crime.